Once I've got the warp off the warping board, it's time to head to the loom. Here I am untying the tie that lets me know where to start, and then I'm going to hang the warp off the loom. It's really important that I don't let the warp touch the floor. Any bit of dust or lint or dog hair is going to actually cause yarn to tangle. So I want to avoid that, and the best way to do that is to keep it off the floor. Then I will find the cross. I will put it through some lease sticks. And then I will repeat this step for all of the remaining groups of warp ends for the whole width of my warp. The next step is to tie the lease sticks onto the loom somewhere. This keeps them holding the cross in place and keeps from losing the cross if they drop out. Once that's done, I can go ahead and untie all of the bows that are keeping the cross in place. I needed the bows initially so that I could keep the cross, but now I need to move things back and forth as I space things out through the rattle. Remember to never tie a knot where a bow will do. Bows are easier to untie than knots, much quicker to untie than knots. If you do have a knot, it probably is going to need to get cut out. You can see that on the first group of warps, I do have one knot that is going to need to be cut out. When I go to do that, I'm going to be very careful not to cut my warp ends. If I did cut them, that would require some repair work and is really just not ideal. It's going to waste yarn and is not fun to do. So I'm going to very carefully cut that knot out, being sure not to cut any of my warp ends. My next step is to space the warp out in the rattle. I'm working at the cross, note to keep everything in order, and I'm working at a set of 20 ends per inch, but my rattle is in centimeters, so I'm going to be putting 7 ends in each space of the rattle. I am reminded of some slick advice from Peggy Osterkamp, because what's happening to me is I'm getting those ends stuck in some of the where they're laying inside the rattle already, and they're not in the spots where I need them to be, and they're not behaving. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay the rattle cap on top, and so they're going to just rest on that smoother piece of wood, and then I'm going to continue to count out my ends. I am using the double-ended brass reed hook from Shacked to help me count out those ends. That helps me identify those ends right at the cross, divide them up, and put them into the rattle. I'm still threading or setting up the rattle, and I switched to using a sheet of paper to cover the rattle and protect these ends from getting caught in there before I'm ready for them to get in the rattle. I'm using the rattle cap for its intended purpose, which is to keep the ends that I've already placed secure in that spot. Next, I just need to continue across the rest of the width of the warp. I'm inching that rattle cap along as I perform this step, and once that paper just isn't staying on very well anymore, I'll get rid of it and just kind of deal with those ends being awkward for the rest of the width. It's really not that long. The next step is for me to wind the warp onto the back beam. So according to Peggy Osterkamp, it's really not considered best practice to keep the least sticks in if you also have another cross at the beginning of the warp like I do. However, she does say that if that's your only lease cross, to go ahead and leave it in. And there are plenty of people who do leave it in. The reason why you would take it out is to reduce drag on these threads. You would think that it would help to even out the tension, but I actually have experienced the opposite. So if you're going to leave them in, you need to be really careful about your tension. I mentioned already that I am hoping to get the whole 6 yards onto this loom, but I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to. So even though I do have a cross at the beginning, I'm going to keep the least sticks in for now. If they turn out to be creating too much drama, I will take them out. But I do think that once I get things wound on or started to wind on, I might move them because it's making me a little bit nervous for them to be this close to the rattle. A lot of people ask whether you should use paper to wind on a warp or sticks. I use both. Today I'm going to start off with paper. This is just a grocery bag that's been cut up. These get reused multiple times. I'm going to start with that, and for maybe my first yard, I feel like they help even out some of the tension issues at the beginning. And then I think I'm going to switch to sticks. These are very thin sticks. And you just want a little bit of separation to keep the warp ends from smushing into themselves. You always want to make sure that the warp is going up and over the back beam, otherwise it just won't weave and you'll have to completely re-beam the warp. I have tied the rattle onto the top of the loom, so it should not be going anywhere. But I'm still going to keep an eye on it, and that cross, those least sticks as expected, are going to be a little bit close there. I want to get everything straightened out a little bit before I make too much drama with these least sticks. Okay, so right now my least sticks are tied to the rattle. So they can't go away from the rattle, and right now I want them to go away from the rattle. So I'm gonna untie them, and I'm just gonna encourage them gently to come down a ways, and I'm going to tie them to this front beam, I think. And that should give me some space. What I'm concerned with here is I don't want the ends to jump up in the rattle. So even though I've got that rattle cap on to prevent any shenanigans from happening, it can, if it can get pushed around. It can get the threads messed up. So I'm just gonna be as cautious as I can dealing with that. So the key here is anytime you feel any kind of tension at all, anytime it feels like something's fighting you, you stop winding on. And I just felt a little snag. And so I'm gonna come back over here and smooth that out. And having it go up and over isn't ideal because of these levers. I had to pull them all forward to get them out of the way so I could put the rattle up there. And now I'm a little bit concerned now that some of my yarn might snag on that. But again, we're just gonna go with it and see what happens. I am very concerned that I want my paper to go on straight. So a lot of times with the Cricket loom, one of the things that I really like about it is that it's so compact. I can just really easily get from one side to the other It's a little bit more cumbersome because I've got a camera in the way today, but I can get really easily from one side to the other, and that makes winding on so much easier. But you always want your paper and your sticks to be going in straight, because that will keep everything under an even amount of tension. So what happens if you don't keep your paper straight or your stick straight? And if you think about it like a cylinder, everything is the same diameter all the way around, and so all of your threads are going to be exactly the same length. But if you instead get off a little bit and it starts winding more like an ice cream cone, or any kind of cone really, they're going to be shorter at one end and longer at the other end, and then you're going to have some serious tension issues, and they're just going to get worse and worse and worse as the warp progresses. So that's why I'm taking the time to make sure that that paper has gone on straight and that everything is staying really consistent all the way across the warp. Now I just need to finish winding the warp onto the back beam, keeping everything consistent and under an even tension. One good way to do this is to add weights to your warp as you're winding it onto the back beam. This is a step that somehow has fallen out of my practice, but it does help you wind evenly and consistently. A warping valet is another option that some people use. So I have gotten to pretty much the end of the warp, the full 6 yards, and I remembered what my holdup was with winding super long warps on the Cricket. I'll show you that in a minute. But what I'm doing right now is I'm untying the rattle, because I still have about a foot that I want to wind on, and I'm going to bring the rattle down to get it kind of out of the way. Okay, the rattle is untied. I mentioned at the beginning that I was a little bit concerned about these levers for the shafts getting in the way, and they do kind of get in the way. They sort of want to snag on things. So maybe a cover, something to keep that protected. Okay, so that looks really sloppy and messy, but most of that is going to get wound on. Okay, that could have been tied. That's a curved edge right there. So, but what I want is to just get this kind of out of the way. This is gonna be passed through the heddles and the reed. So it's, that last foot didn't get wound on well, but it's going to get retensioned. There's still room for it to get retensioned. And I'm going to take the rattle off. I still have my cross in there, and that's important. I need that. We are up under the Cricket Quartet, and I am showing you what is keeping you from winding on the super long warp of your dreams, and that is this bolt right here. It's on whichever side you installed the turning knob to tension the back beam warp. So it is going to get in the way of your sticks or your paper, whichever you choose to use, and that is going to be the limiting factor on the length of your warp. On this particular warp, I had just enough space to do 6 yards with a combination of paper and sticks as my separators. All right, so I've got the warp wound on to the back beam, and now I'm going to thread the heddles. I still have the least sticks. They're now at the back of the loom. I've tied them on to the loom so that they won't go anywhere. And that's going to keep everything organized for when I'm threading the heddles. The first part of my pattern is going to be a straight draw, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 for the blue. So I'm just gonna go ahead and get started on that. These heddles feel like they're on funny. This is the first time I've used a lot of these heddles, so they're not kind of stiff. I do anticipate that I will be using all of my heddles for this project, or almost all, and I do believe that I will be needing to tie in a few repair heddles just to make my pattern work. So the section with the white is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be a straight twill. It's going to have some things that repeat. So even though I technically have enough heddles on the loom, it looks like shaft 2 is going to use 77 heddles, and I have 75 on each shaft. And instead of switching things around, I'll just tie in two repair heddles. That'll be easy enough. Okay, so I've got 4 ends ready to go here, and I am ready, or 4 heddles ready to go, and I am just going to start threading. So that distance is a little bit short, so I'm just going to let a little bit off. Now I'm going to simply thread the heddles all the way across the warp. I am doing this in groups of 4, and as I complete each group of 4, I am pulling them through the reed. This is working simply because of the compact nature of this loom. Notice how I am selecting the next strand of yarn or warp end from that cross that's still held by the lease sticks. This helps keep everything in order and keeps everything from getting tangled. I have noticed that if you don't do this perfectly at this stage, it's not the end of the world. However, it is extremely important to make sure that things stay in order between the heddles and the reed. Next, I'm going to tie the warp on to the apron rod. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select a small group of warp ends. In this case, I'm using 8 ends per group. You want to use something that is small but manageable, but not so small that you're tying way too many knots. The group is going to come over that beam, then split and come around. And then I'm going to tie a surgeon's knot, which is just like you're starting a regular knot to tie your shoes, but instead of going over each other once, they go over each other twice. Once all of the ends are tied on, then I'm going to go across and tighten it. This is done by picking up either end of the tails of that knot and sliding them along the warp towards the reed and then snugging it back down onto the apron rod. I'm going to do this all the way across the warp, and then I'm going to check to see if there are any areas that need extra tension. Once I'm happy with the tension, then I'm ready to start weaving. As always, thanks so much for watching, and if you found this video helpful, be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help. Catch you in the next video.